Some truths never stay buried. They wait for the right moment to come back alive. In the quiet outskirts of a small American town, before anything dangerous ever revealed itself, Ethan Cole had already learned how to live with silence. At 38 years old, a former military medical officer, he carried himself with a calm precision that came from years of discipline rather than comfort. His mornings began before sunrise, walking the same dirt path behind his modest home where the air was still cool and clean, and where only one companion ever matched his pace. Shadow, a German shepherd with intelligent eyes and steady breathing, moved beside him with controlled awareness, not restless, not distracted, but always observing. There was something unspoken between them, a rhythm built from shared history rather than words. Ethan often paused near the old wooden fence line, scanning the horizon as if expecting something he could not yet define. Shadow would do the same, ears shifting slightly, attention locked on distant sounds invisible to most. Life had settled into a pattern that looked peaceful on the surface, yet carried the quiet weight of someone who had once lived through chaos and learned how to recognize its absence too easily. Inside Ethan's home, the walls were simple, filled with reminders of a life that once demanded faster decisions and heavier responsibility. A folded uniform stored away carefully, a few framed documents, and a worn photograph that he never placed in plain sight, but never truly removed from his life either. Shadow's presence filled the space differently, not as decoration, but as awareness, as if the dog itself was a boundary between calm and whatever might come next. On this particular morning, the air felt slightly different. Not loud, not obvious, but subtly interrupted, like a frequency just outside human perception. Shadow stopped walking first. His posture shifted, muscles tightening with controlled alertness. Ethan noticed immediately. He did not ask questions aloud, because he never needed to. He simply followed the direction of Shadow's focus, toward the edge of the property where the tree line met the open field. Nothing visible moved there, yet the silence felt heavier, less natural. A distant sound, barely distinguishable, carried through the wind like an unfinished signal. Ethan narrowed his eyes, his expression unchanged but his attention fully engaged. Shadow stepped slightly forward, positioning himself between Ethan and the unknown direction, not aggressive, but protective in a way that suggested training beyond ordinary obedience. For a moment, everything remained still, the kind of stillness that does not belong to peace, but to anticipation. Ethan exhaled slowly, as if accepting that whatever had been distant for so long was no longer staying away. He placed a calm hand on Shadow's back, not to restrain him, but to align with him. The gesture was subtle, but it confirmed something unspoken between them. They had both sensed it. Something was approaching their quiet world, not with noise, but with intention. And in that quiet early morning light, beneath a sky still soft with dawn, the first fracture of peace had already begun. The silence did not last long enough to feel safe. It never does when something real is about to surface. Ethan Cole stood near the edge of his property with Shadow beside him, both still focused on the distant tree line where the earlier disturbance had been felt but not seen. The morning light had grown slightly stronger now, revealing more detail in the landscape, yet nothing appeared out of place at first glance. That was what made it unsettling. Shadow shifted his weight again, lowering his head slightly, as if catching something subtle carried through the air. Ethan followed his gaze without hesitation. He had learned long ago that ignoring a trained dog's instincts was not an option, especially not Shadow's. A few minutes passed in controlled stillness before Ethan finally turned back toward the house, but not because the feeling had disappeared. It had changed. It was no longer distant. It was closer, more structured, as if whatever he had sensed earlier was now moving with direction rather than randomness. Inside the house, Ethan reviewed a small set of notes on his table, documents from local reports that had circulated quietly over the past weeks. At first, they had seemed unrelated incidents, minor disturbances spread across different locations, nothing that would normally demand attention from someone outside law enforcement. But patterns have a way of forming when no one is looking closely enough. Shadow remained near the doorway, positioned so that he could see both Ethan and the outside environment at the same time. Every so often, his ears would adjust slightly toward the exterior, reacting to sounds too faint for human certainty. Ethan noticed this behavior without interruption, simply absorbing it as confirmation rather than alarm. He had always trusted observation over speculation. A faint knock of wind pressed against the windows, and Shadow reacted instantly, stepping forward one controlled pace before stopping again. Ethan closed the document slowly, his expression unchanged but his awareness fully sharpened. Something was now interacting with their space, not directly, not visibly, but consistently enough to be recognized as intentional presence rather than coincidence. He walked to the front door and opened it without hesitation. The outside air felt different than before, not colder, not warmer, but carrying a subtle shift in pressure that suggested proximity. Shadow moved out first, scanning the yard in a slow, controlled sweep, his posture no longer relaxed but fully engaged. Ethan followed, eyes scanning across the open land, the fence line, and the distant road. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, far beyond the boundary of his property, a faint dust disturbance appeared near the road edge, almost too small to confirm. Shadow locked onto it immediately. Ethan did not speak. He simply observed longer, allowing the pattern to confirm itself. This was no longer just a feeling. It was movement with purpose, approaching indirectly, testing boundaries rather than crossing them outright. Shadow gave a low, controlled, alert posture, not aggressive, but definitive. Ethan placed a steady hand near the dog's shoulder, grounding him without restraint. Whatever was approaching had not revealed itself yet, but it was no longer hidden either. And in that quiet space between certainty and uncertainty, Ethan realized that whatever had disrupted their morning silence was not an accident. It was a signal finally finding its destination. By the time the sun had fully risen, the quiet tension around Ethan Cole's property had not faded. It had simply evolved into something more defined. The sense of being observed or approached was no longer abstract. It was structured, persistent, and carefully controlled. Ethan stood near the front porch with Shadow beside him, both maintaining a calm exterior while their awareness remained fully engaged. The earlier movement near the distant road had disappeared, but neither of them treated its absence as reassurance. Shadow continued to scan in slow, measured intervals, his body language steady yet unmistakably attentive, as if he was tracking something that moved just outside visible confirmation. Ethan reviewed the situation mentally, connecting what he had seen with what he had previously read in fragmented reports. There were patterns of disappearances and unexplained activity across neighboring regions, each one individually dismissed due to lack of direct evidence, but collectively forming a shape that now felt harder to ignore. He had seen enough in his past to recognize when unrelated events began aligning too cleanly. Shadow suddenly turned his head toward the east side of the property, where the tree line dipped slightly and visibility became uneven. Ethan followed the motion without hesitation. The air there felt unchanged, but perception rarely depends on visible confirmation alone. A subtle sound carried through the wind again, faint enough that most would dismiss it as environmental noise, but consistent enough to register as repetition. Shadow stepped forward 2 controlled paces, then stopped, holding position with focused restraint. Ethan did not call him back. Instead, he observed the reaction carefully, allowing the dog's instincts to confirm what logic was still assembling. There was a difference between coincidence and pattern recognition, and they were now clearly past coincidence. Ethan moved slowly toward the side of the yard, maintaining a non-threatening posture while scanning the outer boundary. Shadow stayed aligned with him, mirroring movement in a way that suggested coordination rather than obedience alone. The environment remained visually calm, trees gently moving in the wind, light shifting across open grass, but beneath that surface layer there was an underlying sense of directionality, as if something outside their immediate field of view was gradually mapping their position. Ethan stopped near the fence line. Shadow lowered his head slightly, focusing on a specific point beyond the boundary. There was no visible subject, no clear silhouette, only the suggestion of presence defined by reaction rather than sight. Ethan exhaled slowly, acknowledging internally that whatever was unfolding was not random observation. It was structured attention directed toward them. And in that realization, he understood the situation had moved beyond passive disturbance. It was now an active pattern forming around their location, waiting for the next step to reveal its intent. The stillness around the property finally broke in a way that was subtle rather than sudden, like a decision being made somewhere beyond sight. Ethan Cole remained near the fence line with Shadow beside him, both holding their positions with controlled awareness. Nothing had crossed the boundary, yet the feeling of being studied had become more refined, as if whoever or whatever was observing them had adjusted its distance rather than withdrawn. Shadow shifted his stance slightly, aligning his body toward the same section of the tree line he had focused on earlier. His behavior was no longer exploratory, it was confirmatory. Ethan noticed this shift immediately. He had worked with enough trained systems in the past to recognize when a pattern transitioned from uncertainty to classification. Whatever Shadow was sensing, it was no longer a question. It was an identification without visual confirmation. Ethan scanned the horizon again, slower this time, deliberately mapping angles, distances, and potential concealment points. The environment remained unchanged in appearance, but perception was no longer relying on appearance alone. The wind moved gently across the field, bending tall grass in slow waves. But even that natural motion felt slightly interrupted in rhythm, as though something external was influencing attention rather than terrain. Shadow suddenly took a few steps forward along the inside of the fence line, stopping at a point where the ground dipped slightly and visibility into the tree line became more restricted. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He simply held position with unwavering focus. Ethan followed and stopped a few feet behind him. The distance between them and the perceived point of interest remained unchanged, yet the psychological weight of that direction had increased. Ethan lowered his gaze briefly, reviewing everything he had observed since the first disturbance. There had been no direct approach, no visible intrusion, only repeated alignment of subtle indicators leading toward the same external zone. That consistency was what made it significant. Shadow turned his head slightly toward Ethan, as if awaiting acknowledgement rather than instruction. Ethan placed a steady hand near the dog's shoulder again, reinforcing calm control rather than reaction. He did not move forward, and he did not withdraw. Instead, he chose to observe longer, allowing the situation to continue revealing its own structure. In the distance, beyond the tree line, there was still nothing clearly visible. But the absence of visibility no longer carried the same meaning. It no longer suggested emptiness. It suggested intention held just outside confirmation range. Ethan exhaled slowly, accepting the shift without verbal response. Whatever was forming around them was not random, and it was not fading. It was stabilizing. And in that stabilization, both man and dog understood the same silent conclusion. They were no longer dealing with uncertainty, but with presence that had already chosen its direction. The next phase of the situation did not arrive with force, but with confirmation. Ethan Cole and Shadow remained near the fence line, holding their position as the morning continued to shift toward full daylight. The earlier uncertainty had settled into something more structured, as if the unknown presence beyond the tree line had adjusted its behavior in response to being noticed. Shadow remained focused in a fixed direction, no longer scanning randomly, but locking onto a specific zone with consistent attention. Ethan observed this carefully, knowing that when Shadow stopped exploring and began sustaining focus, it usually meant pattern resolution rather than curiosity. The environment still appeared calm to any outside observer, but Ethan had learned not to rely on surface interpretation alone. The spacing of silence, the direction of wind, and even the subtle pauses in ambient sound now carried more meaning than movement itself. He slowly stepped closer to Shadow's position, aligning himself with the same line of sight. From this angle, the tree line appeared denser, shadows layered in uneven patterns that shifted slightly as wind moved through branches. Nothing moved openly, yet the feeling of structure remained present, as if observation was being maintained from a fixed point beyond visibility. Ethan did not speak. Communication between him and Shadow had already reduced itself to minimal necessity. Shadow adjusted his stance slightly, shifting weight forward and then stabilizing again, as though confirming that whatever he sensed was still present but not advancing. Ethan reviewed the situation internally, considering possibilities without rushing to conclusions. There had been no breach, no direct contact, no identifiable subject. Only continuity of attention directed toward their location. That consistency suggested intention rather than coincidence. He took a slow step back from the fence line, not as retreat, but as repositioning. Shadow followed immediately, maintaining alignment without breaking focus. The shift was subtle but important. They were no longer simply observing the perimeter. They were now testing response behavior through controlled movement. For a brief moment, the environment seemed to adjust again, as if reacting to their repositioning. Shadow's ears lifted slightly, then returned to neutral alertness. Ethan noted it without reaction. Whatever was beyond the tree line was not revealing itself directly, but it was responding indirectly. That distinction mattered. It meant awareness existed on both sides of the boundary, even if confirmation did not. Ethan stopped near the center of the yard, giving himself a wider field of observation. Shadow remained close, slightly ahead of him, still oriented toward the same external direction. The silence stretched again, but this time it carried less uncertainty and more definition. Ethan understood that whatever had been sensed earlier was no longer approaching or retreating. It was holding position. And in that holding pattern, a new phase had already begun without announcement or visibility.